Before we explored the Spencer Mansion for the very first time, and before we got lost in the town of Silent Hill, we first found ourselves alone in the dark. The franchise has been around longer than most survival horror games, even before the subgenre was created. While Sweet Home may have been the biggest inspiration for Resident Evil, Alone in the Dark provided a lot of the mechanics and ideas used for survival horror games for years to come. Unfortunately though, the franchise kind of went downhill after its initial release, with maybe 1 or 2 good entries of the series at best. Because of that, it immediately became overshadowed by other survival horror juggernauts like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and many more. But with THQ Nordic's announcement of a remake to that original game combined with the iconic breakout stars David Harbour and Jodie Comer, things were looking up for the series as it looked like it might finally be resurrected as a new competitor in the constantly growing subgenre of survival horror. But now that it was released a few days ago, the question then becomes, is it good? How does it compare to other AAA survival horror games out there that we've seen in the last year? With the success of Alan Wake 2, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and the Dead Space remake, Alone in the Dark has some major shoes to fill. Well, in this episode of Nerd Space Games, I'm going to dive down into Alone in the Dark as I give you guys my honest thoughts on this game. Let's get it. Alone in the Dark follows 2 protagonists, Edward Carnby and Emily Hartwood, as they search for Emily's uncle, Jeremy. Going into this game, my expectations were somewhat low. Sure, with the iconic cast and premise, the game had a lot of potential. However, there were a lot of red flags going into the release of this game. The biggest one being that the playable demo released last year didn't feature any sort of combat. Considering that we had seen combat in the trailers, the lack of it in the playable demo made me worried that the developers were not confident enough to allow the players to test out the combat in the demo. Instead, the demo focused on puzzles and atmospheric horror, which I felt was done really well. So going into the game, I already had concerns about the core gameplay of Alone in the Dark. And for the most part, those concerns were warranted as the combat came off as clunky, boring, and dated. Starting with the weapons, while having a modest amount of choices, most of them felt relatively the same. Honestly, with the exception of the final boss, which definitely favored the use of the machine gun, every other creature I came across could be taken down pretty easily with any weapon I chose. The game tried to make things a little different by including the use of melee weapons, but because of the clunky controls that I actually thought were worse than the classic Silent Hill games, I found myself choosing to avoid these melee weapons so long as I had the bullets to spare, especially since the melee weapons could literally break after killing 1, maybe 2 enemies at most. For that reason, outside of destroying wooden barriers that were in my way, the melee weapons of the game felt pointless and useless. Also, one last thing I'll say about the combat of the game. I can't really explain why, but something about the aiming just felt off. When I compare it to the competition, Dead Space, RE4, Alan Wake 2, they all had a much smoother process when it came to aiming at the enemies. And before you guys say anything, I did not use the auto aim feature for those games. I'm just saying it was harder to pinpoint your target in Alone in the Dark than other modern survival horror games, which became a real headache as I found myself using up more ammo to kill a monster than I needed to. While on the topic of monsters, another issue that Alone in the Dark suffers from is the lack of enemy variety and creativity. Outside of maybe 3, possibly 4 different types of creatures, the game doesn't really throw much at you. You have a generic Ivy-like monster plus a variation of it that runs faster and hits harder. Then you have a creature that goes on the ground. And finally, you have 2 insect-like creatures, a spider bug and a flying bug. Sure, there are boss encounters, but there's only 2, 3 if you count the stalker enemy in Emily's playthrough, and all of them appear late in the game. I won't jump too much into the late game bosses to avoid spoilers, but let's say that they were all pretty disappointing, which seemed like a reoccurring theme with the enemies of the game. The last negative that I'll say about the gameplay relates to the exploration of the game itself. While most of the time, it's fairly simple and easy to navigate through the different locations that you'll find yourself in, some points of the game made it extremely obnoxious to find the set path to walk on. Actually, the first one that comes to mind is late in the game when you are surrounded by fire. I swear to you, this scene, I spent like 10 minutes trying to find out exactly how and where I had to step in order to proceed to the next section. It was extremely frustrating and annoying to say the least. So I'm sure right about now you guys are thinking about how much I hate this game because of how long I spent on tearing apart the gameplay. But here's the thing, I actually don't hate the game. I don't think it's great, but it's also not that bad. Alone in the Dark features a lot of pros and, if handled correctly, could have been something that would have stood out from its competitors. For one, the story is extremely interesting in my opinion. Sure, it gets kind of hard to follow at times, but honestly, I love the supernatural mystery of it all, and it's one of the few games out there that I found myself reading every single file. Learning more about Jeremy and the patience of the Deserto Manor was intriguing and worth my time to explore. As for the characters, I don't think there was a single bad performance from any of them. Obviously, both Dave and Jody knocked it out of the park with their portrayals of Edward and Emily. Both of them took unique approaches to the story, giving it a different vibe for each character's playthrough. Sure, I wasn't too fond of the original Resident Evil approach where both campaigns were almost identical, but seeing the story from a more rough cop with a past and then again from a more emotionally attached niece of Jeremy made it somewhat worth the replay. Though if I'm being straight with you, I kinda wish I just watched all of Emily's cutscenes on YouTube so that I didn't have to play through all the same shit again. However, my two favorite parts of Alone in the Dark are the puzzles and the atmosphere. Considering that both of these elements were my favorite parts of the demo, I'm not too shocked to see that these areas were what the game did best. Starting with the puzzles, Alone in the Dark features some of the more unique puzzles I've seen in survival horror games. While they did get repetitive and a lot of the time you would end up using the same solution to solve future puzzles, I still found them intriguing and exciting to solve. Most of them gave off an Uncharted vibe, where you'll find yourself using a journal to help you uncover the solution of the puzzle. A majority of the puzzles were found in the manor, so I found myself looking forward to returning back to this place after teleporting to one of Jeremy's memories. Which brings me to the atmosphere of Alone in the Dark. Despite the original game primarily taking place in the manor, the remake explores different areas around the world using Jeremy's memories. From an ancient pyramid underground to a steamboat on the Mississippi River. The different locations throughout the game help keep things fresh as you unravel the mystery of the Deserto Manor. With that being said, the setting of the manor itself provided a lot more atmospheric core than any other location throughout the game. I found myself trying to race through these different locations to race back to the manor so that I could explore new areas within it, solve more puzzles, and take in this feeling of dread that I only got from exploring the spooky manor, especially as time went on and the sun went down. Oh, and that second floor loft area is definitely the creepiest, by the way. The last issue that I had with the game comes from the playtime. Sure, here in the US it sold for $60, which is $10 less than most AAA games, but so did Alan Wake 2. And Alan Wake 2 had at least 12 hours of gameplay in the main story alone. Not to mention you had all the different side activities in the game that added an additional 10 to 15 hours of gameplay. Alone in the Dark took me about 6 to 7 hours to complete Edward's story, and a lot less to complete Emily's, mainly because Emily was my second playthrough, so I already knew the solution to most of the puzzles. But honestly, I don't really feel like giving it too much credit for the second playthrough, as there's not really enough of a difference to warrant a second playthrough. So I would say at best, you can maybe get 9 to 10 hours out of this game, and that's being kind. For that reason, I would highly recommend that if you haven't bought this game yet, then you wait for a deal, because I don't know if I can warrant $60 for a game that's only going to take me 6 hours to beat the main story once, and then maybe 9 to 10 hours if I decided I want to play the other characters playthrough, which is essentially almost exactly the same as the first playthrough. While my expectations were low to begin with, Alone in the Dark still came as a small disappointment to me. Sure, there were definitely highlights to this game, but not enough to really stand out against the competition. In a subgenre that's constantly growing and improving by the day, Alone in the Dark feels like it takes a step back instead. Still, it's hard to ignore the pros of the game. The puzzles, the atmosphere, the sound design, and the incredible cast of characters all keep me from saying it's a poor game and below average. So for all of those reasons, I give Alone in the Dark a 6 out of 10. It's a franchise that I wouldn't want to see dead, but instead learn from its mistakes. Improve the gameplay, extend the main story, and be more creative with the enemy design, and then we could see another competitor enter the survival horror race. Anyway, that's it for today's episode of Nerdspace Games. Have you played Alone in the Dark, and if so, what rating would you give it? Do you agree with my score? Let me know down below. But as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerdspace Games. Take care.